short because the man I will introduce now, who will then introduce our honorable author, is the Honorable Mike Pence. Vice President Pence's recent memoir, I said books, is also, of course, here at Coolidge House, available to you. Did I hold it up right? And we'll say Vice President Pence honors another Coolidge virtue I did not yet mention, which is respect for the rule of law. Vice President Pence demonstrated that in January 2021 when he made the controversial decision to follow the rules and certify the outcome of that presidential election. I'll add a couple more things. Vice President Pence also has something in common with President Reagan. As younger men, they both tested and strengthened their policy skills on the radio. Though Reagan had the safety of taping, Vice President Pence was live. And I know this because it was on the radio that I first encountered Vice President Pence on one of his shows. He represented Indiana for more than a decade. He served as governor of the fair state. Finally, of course, he served as the 48th Vice President of the United States. While serving in that office, 48, as we call Mr. Pence, also did one of his predecessors, we call 29, a singular honor by visiting Plymouth Notch, Vermont, and hanging 29's portrait in the Vice President's office. 29, of course, is Calvin Coolidge. And so we thank 48 Vice President Pence for sharing Ryan Cole with us and for honoring us with his time.
Well, thank you, Amity Slays. I'm going to need a signed copy of that introduction. Thank you so much for your extraordinary leadership. And join me. We're going to recognize a new author rising in the American firmament today. But would you join me in helping to recognize someone who's not only shaped this institution and the memory of number 29, but in my judgment is the singular most gifted and principled historian in the United States of America, Amity Slade. Thank you all for coming out, and I would tell you, you may not know the connection between the Pences and the author that we're honoring and we'll hear from today, but it's deep and it's personal. We both share degrees from the national champion football program at Indiana University, Bloomington. But it goes a little deeper than that. That autobiography that Amity just held up was a labor of love for me for more than a year and a half before it would come out. And the man who was at my side and helped shape and to guide the development of that book is now recognized as an extraordinary author in his own right. And I'm here to pay a debt of gratitude first to Ryan Cole for his friendship, for what he means to our family. But I'm also here to really acknowledge him and his storied family for their incredible contributions to American history, most recently in the form of the last Adieu. I want to acknowledge, believe it or not, although I've known Ryan Cole for the better part of 4 years, this is the first time that I have had the opportunity to sit with and meet the extraordinary Doreen Cole, his mother. And I want to thank you and your late husband for your incredible contributions to our nation. My staff at our foundation, our offices are here in Washington, D.C., is always helpful to me when I'm coming to an event. They say, do we want to put together a few items to write things down? Not always Cal, but sometimes I need a little help. But they said, do you want us to write some talking points for the the book event that you're going to be attending. And I said, no, I read the book. In fact, I took my time with it, and I ended up texting Ryan on the day that I finished it with tears in my eyes, because it tells a story not just about an extraordinary friend who played an incredible role in what we will celebrate coast to coast here, the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence and the war that he fought in at the side of our first president. But also it seems to me almost providential that a book like this has come out, because as you will read when you take time in this book, Lafayette's return to the United States 50 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence happens at a time of real division in America. And America was at a time when we were, political parties had emerged in earnest, and the factions and the factionalism that George Washington actually warned of, Amity, had shown up in its first version in very robust terms. And Lafayette, who had been pressed upon to return to the United States for many years, literally arrives in the 50th anniversary year, and plays an extraordinary and unifying role in the life of the nation. I was particularly moved by the accounts of him actually bringing together President John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson at the same event. Let me just say they didn't exactly get along, but they were united. It was I saw that moment. I saw that moment last night when the United States gold medal hockey team arrived at the State of the Union. You can applaud that, Dawn, if you want. I mean, I'm about ready to bust a tooth out. I'm so proud. But after a very divisive speech last night by my old running mate, according to some, there was a moment where everybody stood and celebrated. And what you're going to read in The Last Adieu is when Lafayette traveled through all those cities relentlessly as a man who at that time was considerably advanced years. He in every sense unified the country because people took a moment to think back on the sacrifices that had been made to earn the opportunity to build this experiment in freedom. I was also very moved by Ryan's description of how General Lafayette, who was literally feted in every community, signs and banners hung on buildings and parades. But I found myself moved again and again at how General Lafayette, by Ryan's accounting, would stop every time he encountered a military veteran of the Revolutionary War. I remember being very moved at the story of the parade going past the home of a deceased veteran and his aged wife standing in the doorway, the way you so eloquently describe it, Ryan, and how General Lafayette stopped and turned and took off his hat and saluted that widow. But I think you'll be deeply inspired as you take time to read this book, and I encourage each one of you to do it, because I think there are lessons here. And as I said, it may well be providential that this book has come out in this 250th year, because we're living in a very similar time where we have strong political divisions. I'm not convinced the American people are as divided as our politics, but our politics are more divided than any time in my lifetime. I really do think that what Ryan's book and The Last Adieu challenges us to do is to think really afresh about what happened 250 years ago. It was a momentous year, not just because 2 centuries ago was the 50th anniversary of the American founding, but also remarkably on the 4th of July of that 50th anniversary, both John Adams and Thomas Jefferson would leave this earth, literally within hours of each other, almost to put a fine point by God's hand on that moment to say this is a year to think of. And our young republic was fragile at that time, but it endured those divisions. It would, decades later, endure a house divided and a great civil war with 600,000 Americans falling. But I actually believe that what moved me the most about the last Adieu was just arriving at the end of the book and feeling as though I'd been able to dip the ladle in the gratitude that poured out just toward General Lafayette, but toward a generation that gave us this great miracle of freedom. And as we think about going forward, my hope and my prayer is that the story of Lafayette, whose portrait and the one that's on the cover of the book hangs in the House of Representatives. I looked at him every day for 12 years. It's amazing to think that the founding generation that built that new House of Representatives would put a portrait of George Washington on one side of the Speaker's chair and a portrait of Lafayette. So if you needed any more encouragement that this is a man worthy of the study of Americans today, you need look no further than that chamber last night to understand that this is a man who was a cornerstone. His personal bravery, so well described in this book, but also his deep and abiding love for America that maybe can be best understood by someone who wasn't from here. We see in this country often that our recent immigrants, like my grandfather, have the most passion for America and for American ideals. And in Ryan Cole's wonderful and eloquent work, you capture the deep love that General Lafayette had not only for his mentor, George Washington, but for the American people. I commend this book to you with my strongest possible endorsement and recommendation. And I know in my heart of hearts, Mom, that this book is just the beginning of what will be an extraordinary career of writing and historical work that will greatly contribute to the life of the nation. So join me in congratulating Ryan Cole on the last Adieu and on his own devotion to America. God bless you.
Thank you. Thank you. Vice President Pence, that was too generous, it was too kind, but I'll take it. Thank you for your friendship, for your encouragement, and most of all for your example. I've heard you say numerous times that democracy depends on heavy doses of civility. Democracy depends on citizens like Mike Pence. And Karen Pence, too. Amity, thank you for years of inspiration. I think many of you in this room have been inspired by her work, too. I'm also grateful to the staff of the Coolidge Foundation for hosting us all today. And speaking of the 30th president, early in his presidency, Calvin Coolidge traveled to Baltimore, where he delivered one of his characteristically eloquent speeches on the centennial of one of the most singular events in American history. This afternoon, we're going to revisit it. The story begins here in Washington on a warm spring day in 1817, when James Monroe became the last member of the Revolutionary generation to enter the presidency. Thus began what is commonly referred to as the era of good feelings. But the moniker is not entirely accurate. The late 18 teens and early 1820s were a period of technological transformation, societal disruption, and political division, as the Vice President alluded to, and estrangement among Americans. Since independence, the size of America had doubled. The number of its people had tripled. 13 colonies clustered around the Atlantic were, after 1821, now 24 states reaching the Mississippi River with designs on the Pacific coast. But a financial downturn in 1819 leveled the American economy, and Missouri's application and admission into the Union, and with it, the westward drift of slavery, provoked a sectional crisis. The presidential election of 1824, a contest between four candidates, John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, Andrew Jackson, and William Crawford, was a prelude to an enlarging democracy of the following decade, and fought so bitterly amongst partisans and litigated with such venom in the press, some commentators wondered if it would lead to the Union's demise. In the middle of all this change and worry, the American people, as any people are wont to do, found comfort in nostalgia. They looked backwards towards their revolution. The approach of the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence in 1826 was accompanied by a fresh curiosity in the era from which it originated. New histories were published, engraved copies of the Declaration were marketed. In recently established states, communities were named for heroes of the Revolution long gone, while national veneration rose for those who still lived. Revolutionary veterans remain, but their numbers thinned regularly. With the passing of each old soldier, headlines cried, "Another hero gone." One great hero who was in a sense gone lives still, and he had not set foot on American soil in 40 years. And cruelly, he had never seen the nation his sacrifices had helped create. His name was Gilbert de Motier, the Marquis de Lafayette, or as Americans called him with great affection, General Lafayette. In 1818, William Eustis, another veteran of the Revolution and America's minister to the Netherlands, had paid him a visit at his home, LaGrange, outside of Paris. There he observed that the Marquis de Lafayette, retired on his farm, waits patiently a better state of things. Lafayette had his own reasons to look back longingly on America's war for independence, when, as an inexperienced soldier, he had grown into the role of a major general and helped the people he had never met and a country he had never seen win its freedom. His service began with a bullet through the leg at the Battle of Brandywine and concluded the Siege of Yorktown, which led to American independence. In between, he became dear to the Commander-in-Chief, George Washington, earned the trust of the American people, and helped win crucial French support for the rebels' war effort. After Cornwallis' surrender, Lafayette returned home at the beginning of 1872, a hero. A decade later, he was burned in effigy in Paris and then languished in an Austrian prison with his wife and daughters, a hero turned casualty of France's tumultuous revolution. When he was at last freed in 1797 and returned to his native country 2 years later, it was with the condition stipulated by Napoleon Bonaparte that he remain away from Paris and out of public life. When a memorial service was held in Paris for Washington, Lafayette, his adopted son, was not invited. With the second restoration of the Bourbon monarchy, Lafayette reemerged, won a seat in the lower house of Parliament, the Chamber of Deputies, and fought to reestablish the rights originally won during the French Revolution. Progress met with reaction when old revolutionaries were elected to office and violent Carbonari plots to overthrow the government, in which Lafayette had participated, were foiled. In early 1825, he was voted out of his seat in the chamber. There he sat, at LaGrange, in poor health, in debt, politically despondent, seeking comfort in thoughts of America. And as it turned out, he was on Americans' minds too. Tender letters he exchanged with fellow veterans, which he had expressed to one day return to the U.S. in order to embrace them again, were shared with and appeared in newspapers. Rumors spread, excitement grew. General Lafayette wished to make one last voyage across the Atlantic. Congress took the initiative and passed a resolution of invitation for Lafayette to visit America and offered him the use of a national ship. He accepted the invitation, but refused the ship. Like he did in 1777, he would find his own way to America. Of course, now he had no money to buy an outfit a vessel. So instead, on July 13th, 1824, he gathered up his son, George Washington Lafayette, a newly hired secretary, Auguste Levasseur, set sail on a packet ship, the Cadmus, the use of which was offered by its captain free of charge. After a month at sea, on July 15th, the ship appeared off of Staten Island, where Lafayette was received by one of your predecessors, Daniel Tompkins, the vice president at the time. Standing on the portico of the vice president's home, crowds gathered around, Lafayette took note of a brilliant rainbow, a sign, he said, of happy omens. Now, Lafayette was well known for his excessive optimism, but here it was well placed. The 15th was a Sunday, and many states and localities forbid travel on the Sabbath. So it was not until the following Monday that Lafayette, at the center of a flotilla of steamboats, reached Manhattan. When he disembarked at Castle Garden on the Battery, the greatest tour in American history was underway, and 13 of the happiest months it would ever know began. On the way to City Hall, bells rang, flags fluttered, women waved and tossed handkerchiefs, while men shouted themselves hoarse. Some of these men were so overcome with the sight of the old hero, they rushed towards its carriage, attempted to unhook the horses, and transport him themselves the rest of the way to City Hall. Once he reached City Hall, citizens, affluent, impoverished, black, white, young, old, waited to shake his hand. All agreed with the sentiments of one American who said to the general, "I am one of the 10 million individuals who owe you the happiness of liberty." From New York, it was on to Boston. On the road, which led along Long Island Sound and into Rhode Island, businesses were closed in anticipation of Lafayette's arrival. If his path did not run through their communities, New Englanders rushed to ones where it did. If he had departed before they arrived, these travelers embarked for the next town in hot pursuit. Schools were dismissed and the roads filled with young boys hoping to catch up with the procession. The line of admirers following it grew so large that the cloud of dust it kicked into the air could be seen for miles on the horizon and choked everyone in its wake. Even the horses pulling Lafayette were reminded of the weight of their task. While a new carriage was being equipped in a Connecticut town, its driver warned one of his horses, "Behave pretty now, Charlie. You're going to be carrying the greatest man in the world." In Boston, thousands of school children stood in columns and greeted Lafayette on the Common. A toast was offered days later when Lafayette visited Harvard. "May America grow old and Europe young." But the first generation of Americans, like Lafayette, had grown old. During his stay in Boston, Lafayette traveled to Quincy to dine with John Adams, who shrugged off his decrepitude and was revived by the reunion and their common recollections of their revolutionary past. From Boston, he returned to New York, where an army of laborers converted Castle Garden into a spectacular amphitheater to host the greatest outdoor party in American history, in Lafayette's honor, of course. He went west to Philadelphia, where Lafayette entered the city at the center of a procession modeled off the Roman Triumphus, which the returning generals paraded victoriously to the Temple of Jupiter on Capitoline Hill. But his destination was a temple of a different sort. In the weeks leading up to his visit in Philadelphia, the room in which the Declaration of Independence was signed, which had sat purposeless and barely evading demolition for years, was refurbished to receive the nation's guest, as Americans took to calling him. When the transformation began in the summer of 1824, the city's planning committee's minutes referred to the building as the Old State House. By the time Lafayette arrived, it had taken on a new name, the Hall of Independence, our Independence Hall. Here in Washington, he passed through the Capitol, received by President Monroe, the unpretentious home of the chief executive. The elite of Paris, Lafayette's secretary imagined, would not leave this White House without proclaiming, "Dear God, how this sovereign house feels bourgeois." On October 7th, Lafayette made his return to Mount Vernon, where he stepped into the crypt and reappeared with tears streaming down his face. Journalists, taking perhaps a touch of poetic license, claimed a bald eagle hovered overhead during the event. I can't confirm that. He went to Monticello. Lafayette's carriage reached the summit of Carter's Mountain. He stepped down, Jefferson stepped off his porch, and the old men walked shakily towards each other, embracing and crying, "My dear Jefferson, my dear Lafayette," as they kissed each other on the cheeks. As Lafayette traveled the eastern states, invitations were extended by their southern and western sisters. He was determined to accept them all. He waited out the winter here in Washington, and at the first sign of spring, departed the capital and headed south. For the next 4 months, he traveled by stagecoach and steamboat on primitive roads and dangerous waterways. He rode through the Carolina pine forest by the light of bonfires in the dead of night. He was pulled onto the shores of the Chattahoochee River by a band of Creek warriors. An Alabama militiaman who watched from his state's side of the river claimed it was the greatest show of a river crossing he'd ever seen. He steamed up the Mississippi into the American frontier, reached St. Louis by the end of April, crossed the Ohio Valley into western New York, along the Erie Canal, and back to Boston, in time, of course, to participate in the laying of a cornerstone at the monument at Bunker Hill on the 50th anniversary of that battle. Consecrating the memory of the Revolution as the representative of its army was not the conclusion of his visit, but was the culmination. When he returned to France after a farewell at the President's house in September of 1825, it was on board a 44-gun frigate, quickly outfitted and manned by sailors from around the 24 states. It was christened by President John Quincy Adams the Brandywine. Brandywine had brought Lafayette into Americans' hearts. It took them away from their shores forever. Now, the mention of hearts speaks to the magnitude of this event, the level of excitement it created among Americans, no matter their color, their class. It consumed the country. So much so that it inspired a flowering of entrepreneurialism. Capitalists created and Americans bought Lafayette boots, badges, umbrellas, hats, sashes, watch chains, gloves, pitchers, plates, even in Lexington, Kentucky, a Lafayette jacket for men that its tailor claimed was dust resistant. I wasn't able to establish in my research whether that was accurate or not. The visit and Americans' admiration for Lafayette left a sizable physical legacy as well. It's difficult to say the number with certainty, but some historians have estimated there are nearly 100 towns, counties, townships named for Lafayette, many founded in the wake of his tour. But many other things were named for him as well. A mountain in New Hampshire, a charity for widows in Delaware, a professorship in Nashville, schools, squares, babies, songs, hotels, even a 500-pound cheese in Georgetown, Kentucky. But Lafayette's farewell cannot be reduced to simply a phenomenon of popular culture. It was a time for Americans to reflect on their past and dream about their future. And as it was a prelude, as the Vice President mentioned, to the 50th anniversary of the country, it can inspire how we mark the 250th. It was a celebration of liberty. The countless number of banquets held for Lafayette usually ended with rounds of toast to him, to his son, to his adopted father, but also to the freedoms won by the Revolution, the form of government created to preserve them. In the procession that brought Lafayette into Philadelphia, the city's printers carried a mobile press. From it, they produced a pamphlet that read, "Freedom of the press protects all other freedoms." And during Lafayette's visit, Americans were reaffirming the singularity of their rights and showing off to the kings and queens of Europe the superiority of representative government. Our semi-quincentennial is an opportunity to once again marvel at the singularity of our values, our rights, and our institutions. You know, Americans were even contemplating their values when it came to Lafayette. Some men and women were wrestling with the compatibility of their republicanism with the frenzied reaction their fellow citizens were having at the sight of their guest. Some thought it was a form of idolatry and inconsistent with the spirit of revolution fought against a king. Now, a woman named Elizabeth Crosby wrote a beautiful letter to a friend describing Lafayette's reception in Boston. All the spectacle she observed was quite ridiculous. But then she could not help but be moved, not just by Lafayette himself, but all the other old veterans of the Revolution on their crutches and the widows of those who had gone to their grave. How could one look on this scene without feeling a pull at their heart, a sense of incredible gratitude? If there was ever a time for hysteria, it was now. That's because this event, its profound emotional impact on America, was not just about Lafayette, but it was about all the other old veterans of the Revolution. And they hobbled forward from the crowds. They were lifted onto platforms, shake his hand, to remind him of their service together, or just to proudly say the words, Brandywine, Yorktown. In Natchez, Mississippi, one old man ripped open his shirt to show Lafayette the scars that he had earned at Brandywine. Others donned the very coats and hats they had worn into battle half a century before, bullet holes still visible. For many of them, it was the last great day of their lives. Even if they had nothing, they were recognized by General Lafayette and the roaring crowds. Now, our 250th is another occasion to revere our veterans, to honor their sacrifices, and our commitments to them. During Lafayette's visit, some Americans were determined to do this even against his interests. In December of 1824, Congress voted to give Lafayette $200,000 in a township of land for compensation for his services in our Revolution. Now recall that it was only in 1818 that the federal government offered lifelong pensions to impoverished veterans. 2 years later, this was amended requiring documentation of financial need, prohibited many men and their families from receiving assistance and threw many others off the rolls. A handful of legislators took considerable political risks and voted against giving Lafayette the $200,000. They couldn't do this, especially with so little deliberation and documentation, when so many other veterans of the Revolution were regularly begging them for assistance. Now, after Congress had voted, Lafayette claimed that he would have sided with the minority. Now, I was shown recently a letter in a private collection written by Lafayette to several veterans of the Revolution in Boston. And in it, he said that if any good came out of Congress giving him $200,000 and a township, it would be that the U.S. government could see that they could afford to meet the needs of all his brother soldiers. Lafayette's visit in a time of division also reminds us of the power of memory, and the importance of not abandoning our passionate political debates, which we fought a revolution so we could have, but finding space outside of them to recall our common citizenship. The Federalist Papers, James Madison had reasoned that Americans were knit together by so many cords of affection. Arriving in the middle of a bitter presidential election, Lafayette and all the old soldiers and remaining statesmen of the Revolution became links in causes of common citizenship in living form. Indeed, the excitement over Lafayette's return quickly eclipsed the bitter presidential election underway when he had arrived. Sure, newspaper editors and their readers were more interested in the nation's guests than Clay, Crawford, Jackson, and Adams. But Lafayette himself observed a national reconciliation of sorts in the grand celebration of the past. He wrote, "I have the satisfaction of thinking that my presence has had a great reconciliatory effect between the two parties. Men who have not spoken to each other for over 20 years are brought together and mutually invited to celebrate us, all because, in his words, memories of the Revolution have come back to life. And perhaps it would do us some good to revive them once more." But of course, the Revolution is ongoing. In September 1824, after traveling up the Hudson, Lafayette wrote to a fellow French veteran of the Revolution, "You cannot imagine how I was struck by the miracle wrought here, by 48 years of independence and instruction in government and liberty. It surpasses my imagination, I know." But thrilled as he was by the progress Lafayette saw, he did not ignore areas where the Revolution was incomplete. He was heartsick at the sight of slavery. "There's only one issue for which I am less resigned than ever, and that is slavery and anti-black prejudice," he wrote from New Orleans. In private, he nudged his friends, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, but he would not publicly scold his hosts or denigrate their achievements. Instead, Lafayette, who had long opposed slavery, searched for ways to end it, spoke by gesture. In New York, he visited the city's free school for black children. In the South, he met in plain view with black men who had served in the Revolution and asked to meet with a battalion of free black men who had fought alongside Andrew Jackson in the Battle of New Orleans. And he reminded anyone within earshot of the valuable contributions black soldiers had made during the American Revolution. Lafayette could take incredible joy in the pride and progress he beheld across America, but also signaled to its citizens and leaders where great work remained. On reflection, it's not difficult to believe Lafayette would contend that the world is better off because of America. He might also admit that we've had our shortcomings, but then he would add, The framers left behind the means for future generations to address those imperfections and continue the work of their revolution. What a great way to look at the history of our country over these last 250 years. I'll close just by sharing that, as I mentioned, a brilliant rainbow greeted Lafayette when he arrived in New York in August of 1824. Another one descended from the heavens when he left in September of 1825. Make of that whatever you wish. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to take 3 questions, and the author is going to sign books, and we have an enormous buffet for you as well. Thank you again.
Okay, shoot.
Let me be first.
Yeah.
Tell Tom.
Many surveys have shown that that the math and the science and the history have declined in our public school system. What you have shared today is just thrilling. It is inspirational. How do we get that, in addition to the school choice movement, back into our public schools and back into our public minds?
Boy, if I knew we wouldn't, if you and I could figure it out, we wouldn't be in this. Teach American history. Amity and I were having a conversation beforehand about history, and we were talking about, my dad actually was a historian, and the type of books that he had recommended to me, like Barbara Tuchman and David McCullough, and we landed on, there's a real virtue in presenting history, facts, especially the history of our country, and letting students reach their own conclusions rather than hammering them over the head with the interpretations of the historian, marshaling the facts. In order to do that, I think that would be beneficial. I try to do that in my book. I've had people approach me who read the book from different political orientations, and they said, you were trying to say this, aligning with their own interpretation of politics, when I really wasn't. But I was happy that they had reached those conclusions. So there's value in presenting the facts and letting readers or students engage in the activity of becoming critical thinkers when it comes to our history.
As opposed to alternative facts.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ryan. It's a great book.
Thank you. Thank you.
Beyond the bald eagle and the dust-proof jacket and maybe the cheese in Kentucky, seems like you've done a lot of research. I was wondering if you could talk about what that research process was like. Where did you find these records? How did you come about them? Did you travel?
My favorite question. And I didn't. We're both from Bloomington, Indiana, so I didn't put her up for that. That was a natural question. There was a lot of manuscripts. It's very driven by letters. It was very important to try and establish what Lafayette was feeling. And then his secretary, Levasseur, who I mentioned, wrote a published journal of their travels. But I was able to access his letters. He sent letters back to France during the trip, which are unvarnished. The published journals are incredibly kind to America, because there was a propaganda element to this tour of making representative government look superior to what was going on in Europe. So those letters were important, but one of the biggest repositories, Cornell, Library of Congress, University of Chicago. But because it's you asking the question, my favorite place for research was the Lilly Library on Indiana University's campus. And the reason why is because I was able to find letters. I was actually going through the files. They have, it's not very well known, but they have one of the best collections of Lafayette material in the country. I found a couple of letters that weren't written by Lafayette or anyone in his orbit. They were written by what you would call everyday Americans. And one of the letters I found was by a woman who had actually traveled to New York City and snuck into Lafayette's birthday party on September 6, 1824, and she wrote a letter to her sister about the experience. It's beautiful. She's talking about meeting Lafayette, but then she gets into a meditation about what this all means, which I mentioned in my talk. Is this right to be doing this, for us all to be going Lafayette crazy? Is it compatible with our values? And I read that and I thought, wow, what a great way to construct the book by getting capturing the feelings of people we've never heard of that are lost to history, what they were seeing, what they were feeling along the tour. And the most amazing thing was, many of them, they weren't just saying, we love Lafayette, or I bought a Lafayette hat. They were wrestling with it. They were saying, this seems a little strange. But they almost always came down on, if there was ever a time for us to engage in something that may be getting close to idolatry, it's now. And it's not just because of Lafayette, it's because of all the veterans of the Revolution. I thought that was very powerful. Yeah.
Last question.
Well, did Tocqueville and Lafayette know each other, and if so, what was the relationship?
They did know each other, and actually, de Tocqueville came to America with a letter of introduction from Lafayette, which he apparently waited forever for Lafayette to write and was quite angry about. I don't think they knew each other that well. There were a lot of commonalities in terms of their background and their relationship to the French Revolution. Trips are very different, though, in the sense that Lafayette's was an exercise. It was a phenomenon of popular culture. De Tocqueville was obviously more of an intellectual exercise. And my recollection is that de Tocqueville was a little confounded by, as many Frenchmen were then and are still today, were a little confounded by our admiration for Lafayette.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank all of you. Thank you for coming.